Welcome to the Gritty Podcast. I am your host, Brian Call. Today I'm joined by my brother, the Gritty Broman. How are you, Brent?
I'm well. Thank you.
You're making some noise over there. What's going on?
Just trying to get blazed.
It's a little early in the morning on this beautiful summer Wednesday day. Mm-hmm. Our grandfather passed away a couple days ago. Mm-hmm. He was a good man, and we have a funeral in a couple of days that we're headed to. Lots of stuff on our mind about life and such. So I thought it would be a good time to visit this topic again on the individual. You know, for those who didn't listen to a previous episode we did called How to Judge a Man, or How Do You Judge a Man? It's really a question that was posed in the title. We discussed the difference perhaps between looking at people as individuals versus looking at people by their group identity. Maybe by looking at them as a Jew, maybe their creed, their religion, or by looking at an individual by their skin color, or by judging a person by their sex, male, female, so on, before actually looking at the person as an individual. We talked about in that podcast where that sort of, where looking at individuals versus groups, where that leads you. You know, it's very dangerous. Human beings have a tendency to devolve into tribalism quite easily.
Very quickly.
Perhaps it's something to do with evolution. I think maybe it does. You know, something to do with our DNA to a degree, I think. Psyche in some way. But regardless, human beings devolve into tribalism pretty quickly. And when you start looking at people in tribes or groups rather than as an individual, judging an individual by the content of their character, we devolve into we move into a toxic place. And I wanted to talk about that today. You know, I keep hearing people talk about all these oppressions in the world that we're dealing with today. It could be, you know, for example, you hear the term systemic racism and so on. You hear people say, well, because I'm a woman, I didn't get the job, and I'm not downplaying that there are bad people out there who oppress other people. That's a reality. That's life. There's also the idea that not every time something goes wrong is it tied to oppression. It could be that the individual just didn't work hard. That's why they didn't get the job. They weren't as qualified. The other day I was reading an article, and it said we must do away with blind auditions for the something orchestra. I'm no musician, so some big time orchestra in the world orchestra of some kind. And it was saying that it was revolutionary to start requiring blind auditions in order to become to make it into this orchestra. The reason was because there was a lot of racism in the world. So they're like, hey, you know what? You're going to judge people solely on how they sound. It's like an elk calling championship.
Mm-hmm. You don't know who's behind the curtain.
You don't know who's doing the calling. Mm-hmm. You can't come to any preconceived decision on who you're going to pick. You're going to listen to the person who's the best caller. It could be a 12-year-old kid. It could be Corey Jacobson. You don't know, right? And so what does that do? It removes your biases, right? And it strictly judges the person on their merit. And that's what they wanted. They wanted, early on, they're like, look, we don't have any people of color. We don't have any Hispanics or black folks in this orchestra because you're all racist. So what we're going to do here, you know, we're going to do blind auditions, and then we're going to pick people based on their ability, as it should be, based on their merit. It shouldn't be whether you're white or black. It should be, are you good enough to do this? Are you talented? Do you make it into this group based on your abilities? When you have a merit-based system, which is, I would argue, what the United States generally is based on. People always want to talk about the hierarchy of power. Everything's a power hierarchy. And if you're Marxist, that's sort of your belief system, right? That there are people with power who keep people without power down. But it's a really, we talked about this before, and power and money tend to be tied hand in hand. But not everything is power motivated or money motivated. Not everything runs under that system. In fact, there's a better argument that it's competency based, meaning the most competent individuals, the most capable individuals sort of rise to the top. The best elk caller and elk killer sort of rises to the top because of their abilities, right? It's not that they have that position because they have all the power and they keep the other callers from beating them in the championship, from being able to kill an elk in the mountains. That's one of the reasons I love hunting, because nature doesn't give a dang if you're in a position of power or not. If you go out on a public land over-the-counter elk hunt with a bow in hand and you just boom, you walk out there, you're on even ground with everybody else. Who gets the elk? The person with the most competency. So the harder you work, the more you grind, the more effort you put in, the more you focus on honing your skill, the more failures you have that then lead to knowledge and then greater success. That's a competency hierarchy. It's merit-based. Now, you're endowed at birth with a certain number of limitations, right? Your IQ is only as high as your IQ can be, right? So within the limits of what you've been blessed with,
You're only going to get so tall.
you can only go so far. I can't be Michael Jordan in the NBA.
Will never dunk.
I'll
get real close. I'll get real close.
Yeah, I can hang from the rim for being a 5'10" white guy. That's pretty good.
That's great.
I got some hops, but I ain't Jordan, right? And within the limits of my endowment, though, I was able to play some pretty good hoops, right? Because I worked hard at it. So there's always, and the thing is, in the world today, you're never going to be able to make everything absolutely equal. And it's foolish to try to do so. Because if you were to take, for example, the NBA, and you had Michael Jordan and all the fellas, Charles Barkley and Magic Johnson and Larry Bird and all the dream team guys playing.
That's a dream team.
And you're out there and you're playing ball. The NBA wouldn't be very fun to watch if you just decided that so many people of this color should come in, so many people of this. We need as many white people as black people, right? Like, that doesn't make any sense. The NBA is merit-based. It's like the best of the best by competency that's how they win the championship. That's how they progress. That's how the NBA becomes what it is, or the NFL or any sports league. It would be, on its face, it's ridiculous to do it based on any kind of, any other measurement. It doesn't make any sense to, for example, say, well, Jordan, you jumped too high, Michael.
You can only jump 6 times a
So
game.
you're going to need to play with 30-pound weights around your hip so that you can not jump as high as, this guy over here, because it gives you too much of an advantage. And so we're going to take your endowment, your natural gifts, and we're going to stop those, and then we're going to even it out so everybody's even. Nobody wants to watch that. It doesn't make any sense.
That sounds like that No Child Left Behind program they instituted when I was in school. Because Billy over here is a dummy. No one else is going to learn anything new until Billy gets it.
Yeah. It's unfortunate that in some ways, because nobody wants to hear the hard truth.
No, Billy was dumb. It's not his fault.
It's not. And we should have some things in place, programs, I think, that help with the disenfranchised.
Yeah, I couldn't read at 3rd grade. Couldn't read at all.
Yeah, and there are some folks, like when you dive into IQ, IQ is the leading predictor on success in life, a person's success, right? So when you're too high, you're a little out there and you're not very successful because you're like Rain Man.
Yeah, you're like a little wonky.
Like there's something off. When you're too low, you can't think straight. You can't do basic things. You forget stuff. You're not very intelligent. And then there's that sweet spot kind of in the middle where it's like, if you're here at this top tier, you're probably going to be really successful in life. The next tier, you're right about here. The next tier, you're there. It's not to say that there's not other indicators, like I had 2 parents and stuff like that, but IQ is a big part of it. So not everyone is born with the same level of intellect. It's just a fact. And so if you try to make everything equal, it won't happen. But what is the best way for any individual? I say this all the time. I say this to my kids. Okay, remember this, Brent. Remember this. When people give me all these, well, Brian, but this isn't fair, and this isn't fair, and what about this, and this isn't fair, and I can't do this like this guy, and even though I try, I'll never shoot my bow like Levi Morgan, but I want to. It's like the solution is still the same. The solution is still the same. no matter what your endowments are. And that is personal responsibility. It's always the same. I heard, I heard Kanye West in the Oval Office talking to Trump, a year or so ago or whatever. And he said something that stuck out in my head and has ever since. He was sitting there and he's talking and he's like, people told me that Donald Trump was a racist. And he's like, and he didn't deny whether or not that was true or false. All he said was, you think racism is going to stop me? Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? I do not care about racism because the solution is still the same. Mm-hmm. His point is, I'm still going to win. I don't care what the roadblock is. I'm still going to win. I'm still going to find a way. And I think that is so much more healthy of an approach to life than what you see today with people saying, it doesn't matter how hard you try, all these roadblocks are in your way, and therefore you can't get ahead unless someone else comes in and does things for you.
This is just making me think of our mother. Can you think of any way to get a job done faster than to tell her she can't do it?
I think that it is absolutely empowering to acknowledge that you are an individual. It's absolutely empowering to take on your own responsibility to be better. Let's say your IQ is not great. Take, for example, my basketball career, as illustrious or as not illustrious as it was. Okay, I was able to take my 5'10" stature with my natural, what should we say, white European descent, genetics. And I was able to carve out, through hard work and persistence, some abilities that were within my endowments. I took on that personal responsibility, maximized what I had been given, what I have within my means to become a functional, useful, solid player on a team, right? Sometimes dominant in certain groups, right? Under certain situations. But let's face it, I'm never going to be LeBron James. I'm never going to be Michael Jordan. That's not within my ability, but the solution was still the same. If I wanted to be a player, I still had to take personal responsibility and work my butt off to be the best that I could be within my abilities. The same is true as for hunting. I'll probably never, I think I can safely say I will never call like Corey Jacobson. Never. And I could practice my whole life and still probably never be able to call like Corey. There's some people that are just gifted, right? There's others too. No matter how hard I try, I'm not really good at musical instruments, and it is one. And so there are going to be others that seem to have a knack for that and be better at it. Does that mean though that I should just quit because I can't do it very well, like as good as so-and-so? No, it means I take on my own personal responsibility within my own endowments, within my own abilities to work as hard as I can to maximize what I can do. That's why I say the solution is still the same. It's always personal responsibility in every situation. The solution is the same. You do the best you can. Now, I've had a lot of people say, no, but you can't do that when you're a victim. You can't take on personal responsibility when you're a victim. And I have compassion for that concept. And there is true to a degree. It really is true to a degree. But again, it goes back to, but yes, it's true, but the solution is still the same. There's only so much you can do to change your outer world sometimes, but you are always in control of the individual and yourself. So I want to illustrate this by reading excerpts from Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning.
I was just going to say, this is really reminding me of Viktor Frankl.
Because if you've not read the book, which you should, I think every person should read the book and read it multiple times. It's called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And he's a Holocaust survivor from Nazi Germany concentration camps. He's a Jew, and he talks about this idea of individuals being self-determining. And there's some quotes in there where he talks about how, as a prisoner in concentration camp, you're a victim. You're absolutely a victim, and you're being oppressed by someone in power
24/7.
Yet he still asserts, even in that situation, that you still have control over the individual. Man still can determine who he will be from one moment to the next. Of course, within the limits of the situation. But that concept is also empowering. It also makes you think about meaning in life. Like, when everything in the world has been taken from you, everything, every liberty, physical, outward liberty, gone, what is there left? And he asserts that there's a lot that's left. There's a lot. And I'm going to read some of these quotes and just let me hear what you think, because I think that these ideas were discovered through the trials that he went through the death that he saw and the torture and the horrific things that went down in these concentration camps, these gas chambers, and how they were treated like rats or insects. How they were stripped they were stripped down naked, their heads shaved. They're no longer human beings. They're just less than a rodent. And then the things they do to young women and children, what they do to men, working them till they die on a railroad track and 20 degrees below zero. These are things that we, as in modern day, especially most of us in the United States, have not had to endure or experience. I think that it's wise for all of us to listen to someone who came through that. The odds of him surviving was like 0.00001%.
He was pretty much there the entire length of the war.
And it's just unbelievable that he made it. And one of the things he said, I heard, Jocko Willink did a podcast on this. If you want to go check out Jocko's podcast on Man's Search for Meaning. But one of the things he focused on, one of the things he was saying was that it was really maybe from the guard's perspective where Jocko covered it. How could you go from no one thinks of themselves when they read that book
as the guard,
right? We tend to think of ourselves how would we handle it as a prisoner? How would we? And Jocko's like, no. How dark is your heart that you could be corrupted to treating Jews this way and becoming the jailer, pushing women with their babies into a gas chamber, knowing you're going to kill them all? How do you become that guy? And this is why I say the individual and adopting personal responsibility is so vitally important. Because if you don't think that you could become the prison guard, you're wildly naive. Because the line of good and evil runs through the middle of every human heart. You and I both know, Brent, that we have a capacity for evil that we have to keep at bay all the time. And we have a capacity for good that we have to foster as best we can. And as human beings, it's a daily battle. It's a daily roll call. Which guy are you going to be today? And if you don't, like Anne Frank says, she's like, I need to uphold my ideals as best I can because someday I may be called on them to use them. To me, that means like you can't just be a mediocre human being. You can't just go through life doing what's expedient, what's the easiest, what's the least difficult thing in life. And then when a trial comes up and something difficult is coming your way, something harrowing like, you're called on to treat Jews like insects. How do you have the character then to withstand that evil? How do you have the character to actually take that other road, which is to fight against Hitler? Later, we're going to read in this podcast from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who deals with this very thing as an individual. Does he decide to just, go along with Hitler? Or does he stand up to Hitler? And what does that mean? And where does it lead him? And does he have the individual responsibility to do so? But before we do that, I want to get into Victor's comments. From the book, Man's Search for Meaning, he says, ultimately, man should not ask what the meaning of life is, but rather must recognize that it is he who is asked. In a word, each man is questioned by life, and he can only answer to life by answering for his own life. To life, he can only respond by being responsible. So there's that word, responsible. That's the opposite of being victim, choosing to be victim. When you choose to adopt victimhood, you can dismiss your personal responsibility, right? And that leads us down a whole new path because when, there's a horrifying book out there that illustrates this. Jocko Willink did a podcast on it. About a year or so ago. It's episode 85. The book is called Ordinary Men, Reserve Police Battalion 101 and the Final Solution in Poland. When you go to Amazon, it says this in the editorial reviews. It says, shocking as it is, This book, a crucial source of original research used for the bestseller Hitler's Willing Executioners, gives evidence to suggest that the opposite conclusion, that the sad sack German draftees who perpetrated much of the Holocaust were not expressing some uniquely Germanic evil, but that they were average men comparable to the run of humanity, twisted by historical forces into inhuman shapes. Browning, a thorough historian who lets no one off the moral hook, nor fails to weigh any contributing factor, cowardice, ideological indoctrination, loyalty to the battalion, and reluctance to force the others to bear more than their share of what each viewed as an excruciating duty, interviewed hundreds of the killers, who simply could not explain how they had sunken into savagery under Hitler. A good book to read, along with Rosenbaum's comparably excellent study explaining Hitler. The story goes, you have the police battalion, 101 in Poland. They are told by the Germans, hey, you need to go round up all the Jews and you need to kill them. And they're pretty much average Joe dudes. They're not real into Germany, for one. They're out in over in a city, this battalion. I don't remember the politics involved or all of that. But they take a normal police force that's out there protecting the people and kind of doing what they do. And then they get orders from the German army once they invade Poland. And this group is now tasked with going and killing man, woman, and child and executing them. And they don't want to do it. They hate the idea of it. They're not bloodthirsty for this. Some of them are vomiting and can barely do it, but they go out and they shoot pregnant women. They execute mass hordes of children and crying 11-year-olds, 7-year-olds, families in the woods and bury them. And the question is, how could a normal person like you or I, Brent, go out and commit such an atrocity? How is it that they didn't all rebel and say, I will not do this. I will not kill this 4-year-old begging for her life. Not going to do it. Yet they did, to a man almost. They went along with it. And so it's sort of, Jocko does a great job of breaking this down. And if you haven't heard that episode, you need to go and listen to it. Because if you have any illusions that you're some sort of incredibly moral person who could only be, inspired to do good, then you have no idea what you're capable of, what human beings are capable of, the evil that we're capable of, every single one of us. It's one thing that bothers me today is you hear what's kind of in vogue is that there's no such thing as good and evil. There's just, societal problems. It's like, no, every damn day, you and I both know there's a battle to choose between good and evil every day. We're confronted with it all the time. Do we lie about this thing? Do we tell the truth on this thing? Do we do the right thing here? Do we do the wrong thing here? Do we do what's most meaningful or what's the most expedient? We're confronted with it every day. And if you choose the dark path, it doesn't take long before you could find yourself down there. You can justify and rationalize a lot of evil. And that's why I don't like the oppressor-oppressed narrative in one, because it dismisses personal responsibility. And when you dismiss personal responsibility, you invite victimhood, and then you invite all sorts of rationalizations into your mind on how you should be able to treat other people or how you should be able to be dishonest or steal or rob in the name of justice because you're a victim. It leads down a dark road. And so this book is harrowing and disturbing, and that's why you should read it. So back to the book with Viktor Frankl, he's saying people are in concentration camp and they're like, what is the meaning of life? Like, how did I end up here? My family, my wife and children have been gassed in the chamber. I may not make it out of this. Better had I never been born, right? And his response is, each man, it's not you asking what is the meaning of life, but rather each man is questioned by life. To life, he can only respond by being responsible. And by adopting that responsibility, there's some meaning that you find. There's no meaning in adopting victimhood. There is meaning in responsibility, because here's the deal. If you adopt responsibility, then everything is in your control. There's meaning in that. If you accept that everything is in your hands, the solution is still the same. Like I said, it's you. It's always you. If you adopt that, it's just like Jocko's book, Extreme Ownership. It's always you. At the end of the day, You could have all sorts of circumstances that press you or get in your way or roadblocks to your success. But the solution's still the same. It's still you overcoming them. And to teach anything else is disempowering to people. It leads down that dark road, like I was saying earlier. Now that's a little bit deep right there. So let's get on to another quote from Victor that's a little more basic. He says, "A human being is not one thing among others. Things determine each other, but man is ultimately self-determining. What he becomes within the limits of endowment, like we said earlier, I'm not endowed with the same abilities that Michael Jordan had, right? I'm endowed with Brian Call endowments. So what a man becomes within the limits of endowment and environment, meaning he only has the limits within his own environment that the Nazis allow him to have in a concentration camp. So he has his personal endowments that he's born with, whatever skills or abilities or intellect he might have, whatever height, stature, physical abilities he might have. And then there are limits to his freedom based on his environment, right? This is what he says. What man becomes within the limits of endowment and environment, he has made out of himself, right? You become, of course, within the limits of my ability to be like Jordan. I became what I have become on the basketball court because of my endowments, because of what I did.
Mm-hmm. It's like when people say that they are a product of their environment. Not really. You are a product of what you do with your environment.
Exactly. Very different mindset. Mm-hmm. Back to Victor. He says, what he becomes within the limits of endowment and environment, he has made out of himself. In the concentration camps, for example, in this living laboratory and on this testing ground, we watched and witnessed some of our comrades behave like swine, while others behaved like saints. Man has both potentialities within himself. Which one is actualized depends on decisions, but not on conditions. That's a powerful statement. Because what he's saying is, in that concentration camp, you had people who decided within the limits of endowment and environment, they decided for themselves what sort of human being they would be, whether they would be a saint or whether they would be swine. And he talks about how evil some people were. He also says a very poignant thing, that those of us who survived know that the best of us didn't make it out, meaning the people who were the most animalistic, the most vicious, often were the ones who survived concentration camp, not the saints who would rather die than become a prison snitch and get someone else killed for, a stick of bacon. At the end of the day, though, what he's saying is both men were under the same conditions. Both men were under the same oppression within the camp. Both men had the same potentialities. Both men could become either swine or saints. Which one they became completely depended on their decisions that they made as individuals, not on the conditions that were pressing on them. That is some heavy responsibility. If you adopt that attitude, if you believe that, that is some heavy responsibility. That means you're saying, no matter how much pressure I get, I'm going to do the right thing. I don't know that I have the character to do that. It's like saying, imagine a prison guard coming to you and saying, I'm going to chop off these 3 fingers if you don't tell me who did X, Y, Z. And it's like a 12-year-old kid who's just starving to death. It's like, do you sign that kid's death warrant or do you lose your 3 fingers? Like, these are not easy decisions to make, right? These are heavy choices. And that's why I say developing the character is something that has to be done if you choose to be in control of your own destiny and you choose to assuage or stand up to evil. You better develop the character it takes to do so, because when the time comes, like Anne Frank says, you can't just call on those ideals if you didn't develop them. Later he says, what is demanded of man is not, as some existential philosophers teach, it's not to endure the meaninglessness of life, but rather to bear his incapacity to grasp its unconditional meaningfulness in rational terms. It's pretty deep. I think when you're in concentration camp for 4 years and you're trying to survive and you see all this death and destruction around you, you're going to have some deep thoughts. Mm-hmm. But he says, some philosophers, he says, existential philosophers, some especially atheist philosophers, teach that what's demanded of human beings is to endure the meaninglessness of life. with your fist shaking at the universe and saying, even though there's no meaning in life, I'm still going to live life. And he's saying, I don't agree with that. Rather, it's man's responsibility to within our limited capacity to grasp that life is unconditionally meaningful, even though we don't understand it. So this reminds me of the book of Job. Whether you subscribe to any faith or don't, there are stories that are old, really old in human history. And many of these stories, like the ones you find in the Old Testament, they're even older than the version in the Old Testament. You can find parts and pieces of some of these stories in civilizations from years prior. These stories are kind of old, like from the beginning of time, and human beings have passed them on from one generation to the next. The book of Job, it's kind of a bum deal for Job. Because if you don't know, like Job's just doing Job things, like kicking butt.
He's a good dude, getting stuff done.
Everybody loves him, and Satan comes to Job, or comes to God. Like they're all in heaven, like, the gods.
When you think about Job, I want you to picture in your guys' mind the best person you know in your life.
Ever met.
And he sucks compared to Job.
And so Job is just the coolest dude ever, and nice and everything. And Satan, who is like the personification of evil, like he is the representation of evil embodied in a person. This evil comes to God and says, that Job dude, he's not that good, really. I mean, of course he's good because he has everything going for him. But if he didn't have everything,
his life's so easy.
Yeah, but if he actually had some trials, he wouldn't be very awesome. And God's like, oh, sure he would. And he's like, yeah, but would he? Satan's like, would he? Really? So God says, well, dude, you can do anything but kill him. Have at it. Go do whatever you want with Job. It's so arbitrary. It's so capricious. It's so just willy-nilly unfair what God does here. But he says, and it's very representative to me of what evil really is like in the world today. It's not fair. If you're going through the world thinking life should be fair, you're going to have a really, really bad life because it ain't fair. No. It's not. Quit thinking life should be fair or equal. It's
innocent die young and dirty people live forever. It's not fair.
And so here comes this evil, drops on Job. Job loses everything. He struggles. And throughout the whole thing, Job does all right. And this is a whole different discussion, but his friends come to him. And his friends say, Job, dude, I hate to say it, man, but you must have done something wrong for this to happen to you. Like this wouldn't have been happening to you if you were a good person. And he's like, no, dude, I've been a good person. And they're like, but have you?
Yeah.
Have you?
Your house burned down. All your fields are just turned to mush.
And in their
family's all dead.
In their mind, they're like, it's a justification for the evil. It's a dangerous road to go down. When they justify the evil on Job, they blame Job for it. Us as human beings, we want justice. We do. And they want there to be a reason this is happening to Job. They certainly don't want it to just be happen chance. Then it could happen to anybody, right? You want to earn your way into what you think you deserve. And so they're like, dude, you must deserve this, right? And in that book, Ordinary Men, some of these police officers do the same thing. They're like, well, we've been told to murder, 1/3 of this population in our city. My son's best friend is a Jew. I'm supposed to go kill him in the woods, but he's a Jew. He must deserve it, or otherwise Hitler wouldn't tell us to go do it, right? And they justify evil. And in a reverse way, these people are saying to Job, well, you must have earned it. If this is happening to you, it must be because it's supposed to, right? And so Job's like, no, I didn't do it. I don't have anything. So Job says, God, I want an accounting. This isn't fair. I didn't do anything wrong. I demand justice. And God comes down and he says, were you here when I created the world? Were you here when I made man? Do you know what the world is about? Do you know the secrets of the cosmic universe? And Job's like, no.
Not in particular.
No. And God's like, yeah, So how about you just put a little faith in me, right? How about you just go, okay, I'll accept it. I'll accept it, and I'll just take on my personal responsibility within the limits of environment and endowment. And I'll do the best I can. And there's a lot more psychology that goes into this story of Job. It's always resonated with me because Job says at the end of the day, he says, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. Meaning he decides at some point that no matter what hardships, no matter if he ends up in concentration camp under the worst conditions, he's saying, no matter what life brings, yet will I believe in my responsibility and try to do what I need to do. I will take the good path no matter what. And there's a certain faith that goes into the idea that, okay, like Viktor Frankl says, faith in saying, okay, life has meaning. I just don't quite know what it's all about. And I'm going to go on the idea that it's there, though. And I say this all the time. You have a choice in life. You can say, none of this matters, and you can dismiss all personal responsibility. And with that comes the freedom of not really having to push yourself too hard or basically justifying any deed you want to commit because there's no point. But with it also comes the fact that there's no point. There's no meaning. If you adopt the idea that life is ultimately deeply meaningful, then it comes with a tremendous level of responsibility that you're obligated to adopt and live out. And that means your life is filled with meaning and some purpose. Like you have a job to do.
I may not understand the meaning of life, but I can witness the fruits of the two mentalities, and I know which one that I want.
Yeah. Well, one thing that you can do is experiment with either one and see.
Yeah, I've been there, done that too. And again, I know which one I want.
Victor goes on to say, a man's concern, even his despair over the worthwhileness of life is an existential distress, but by no means a mental disease. In some ways, he's saying people who suffer from depression, I think, that are possessed with despair over the worthwhileness of life, like, people who are nihilistic a little bit. That is by no means a mental disease. Yes, it's an existential distress. There's something about it that plagues your conscience, right? There's something about, the meaninglessness or the meaningful part of life that plagues your conscience. But he's like, it's not a disease. It's not a mental illness. Depression is not so much a mental illness in some ways, he's saying, as much as it's your conscience and your soul kind of speaking out.
I agree with that. I worked at the Utah State Mental Hospital for a year, and I was given the job of being a psychiatric technician, which basically means I'm a glorified babysitter.
Yeah.
My job was to go there, and I'm a big dude, so I would sit outside an open door of a patient's room and watch them while they slept, because they either weren't eating or they had hurt themselves or were in danger of hurting others. Mm-hmm. And we had weekly trainings. One of our shifts every week was just training, where we would sit down. We'd have empathy training where we would put on headphones and try to understand what it's like to have voices talking to you while you're trying to go about your daily business. Mm-hmm. So we'd have empathy for the patients, or we would, there was lots of trainings that we did. But one of the things that I kept finding was that most of the time someone has a mental illness, it's brought on by improper or bad thoughts. And then it's normally perpetuated by drugs. So normally you have someone who says, I'm fat, I'm sad, I'm an ugly person, I stink, whatever you want to say. They're having these thoughts that they're feeding themselves that are not healthy. And then they normally find alcohol, tobacco, marijuana, and drugs. And it makes them incapable of having the proper thoughts to fight back. Because what happens is if you get super fat, we know the cure is exercise and diet. And it's a long road back. If you have bad thoughts perpetually for years, or you have abusive people in your life that you are incapable of cutting out, that tell you you're bad, tell you you're a piece of crap, it's a long road of proper thinking and building up your self-esteem to get back to a healthy place.
Right. I'm no psychologist. I'm no doctor.
I'm not either. I just saw a lot of crazy people for a year.
But I think that there is a lot of truth in what you're saying there. He says, back to the book, he says, if there is meaning in life at all, then there must be meaning in suffering. Suffering is an ineradicable part of life, even as fate and death. Without suffering and death, human life cannot be complete. anyone in the world who thinks that there's this potential for a utopian society where there's no more suffering, that is an out and out denial of what life is. Like Viktor Frankl says, if there's meaning in life at all, there must be meaning in suffering, because suffering is an ineradicable part of life. Like it's an absolute.
It's a part of the human experience. Could you imagine, okay, hypothetical, they get what they want. They've created this utopia where suffering no longer exists. Would you want to live there? No. Imagine hanging out with those people. They would suck.
There's some psychologists that said the first thing that would happen in that situation is humans would go out and do something bad to break up the utopia, just so that there could be some challenge and strife. Because
look at it. We have people all around looking for strife.
It's just like, what do you want to do? You know, oh man, I love to just sit on a beach and relax and sip margaritas all day. Dude, you'd be bored with that after 2-3 days.
Yeah, then you're going to find a pier, start jumping off the pier, just doing dumb stuff.
And so there's something about risk and challenge and things that we crave. Adopting personal responsibility and overcoming challenges is absolutely something that we all thrive off of, that all human beings need. But I think that there's a lot of wisdom in this, saying that pain and suffering are absolutes, that they are things that will never go away, that are part of human existence. There's no, it's as real as anything in the world. The knowledge, the understanding that pain and suffering are part of life. It's the most realist thing in human existence. You cannot deny that pain and suffering exist. You can't deny it. It's an absolute in our existence. And when you accept that, there's a certain freedom, I think, a certain wellness that comes to you when you go, okay, yeah, life is
going to hurt at some point.
Suffering. So then what would be, as an individual, what would be the steps you take given that knowledge? Perhaps to give your life meaning, knowing that it's plagued with misery and suffering, pain. Perhaps one of the things you could do is take on the responsibility of minimizing as much pain and suffering in the world as possible. Maybe that could be the meaning you find in life, is to reduce or to minimize human suffering as much as possible, or suffering in general. That's a tall order. But imagine if you spent your life really, really, really trying to minimize the suffering that's in the world. And the danger there sometimes, how do you minimize the suffering in the world?
I was going to ask you, could we dive into that a little bit? Because we did a podcast about a year ago, kind of on a similar-ish topic, or we went on a tangent on this. And it got me thinking about ways that I cause suffering in my life, especially unintentionally. Mm-hmm. If I'm going out and I'm binge eating and I'm putting on weight, I'm causing suffering, not just to myself, but to those around me. Mm-hmm. What if I get so out of shape, so bad that I become super unhealthy, get sick and die after having 2 or 3 kids? That's a lot of suffering that I caused by not really causing a lot of suffering. Does that make sense? I wasn't hurting anyone up front, especially. I'm just eating some ice cream, bro. What's the big deal?
Well, again, it goes back to personal responsibility versus accepting personal responsibility versus not. So a lot of times people go, yep, I agree. The world is full of suffering. And the best way to fix it is for me to pass a law or to put on some societal change or to get this group of people to stop doing this to this group of people, right? All the while
forcing people to obey, it's fake responsibility.
It's fake responsibility, because what happens is it's like, perhaps what you should do is become a better human being first before you start telling the society how it should behave.
Here's the deal. If you have a society of badasses, it's going to be a good society.
Right.
Not if you have a society with a bunch of rules trying to make you into a badass.
Here's my issue with a lot of activism today and a lot of activists. These people don't pay their bills. They don't accept personal responsibility.
Well, they can't have a job when you're protesting 24/7.
They don't have jobs. They live off of their parents or someone else. They steal. There's no personal responsibility that they adopt, yet they're out there trying to create artificial meaning to their existence by forcing changes, by making societal changes. So the way to a healthy society is not through society, but through individuals. It goes
Not through the
back
group.
to individual responsibility. Again and again and again, the solution is still the same. Individual responsibility. If you want to make America better, it's through individual responsibility.
Well,
If you're not responsible, if you're not like taking care of your role as a husband, let's say, or a mother, or a wife, or a father, you're not taking on your responsibility as a brother to your immediate family. You're not taking on your responsibility for your own health and wellness. If you don't have discipline in your own life, doing your own under the things by which you have control over, you're not paying your bills. The last thing you should be doing is going out and trying to tell other people how they should live. You haven't got it figured out. You can't even run your own life. And I think that it's a very healthy thing to say, for people to say, you know what, I'm not going to go out and be an activist until I get my own together. Like I got my own mess, right? Until I sort my own mess out, I really, I should have a little more humility before I go out and try to change the world. I think when you decide to look at individuals and you adopt individual responsibility and you accept that others do too, and within the limits of their environment and their endowment, you give people the opportunity to adopt responsibility, then you go ahead and you embrace things like blind auditions. Back to what I said earlier with the orchestra, blind auditions allowed people, regardless of their race or creed or their sex or their skin color, it allowed those people to make it into the orchestra, right? Well, last month, there's all these articles that came out that said we need to get rid of the blind auditions. They're not helping. The blind auditions have got to go away because obviously there's not enough diversity. There's too few people of color. We want more.
So what happened? They instituted these blind auditions, and then it's a bunch of Chinese and white people now?
Basically. And now they're like, we want it to be half people of color.
All right, fine. Let's do that with the NBA. Let's do that with the NFL.
And that's where you start to see like that doesn't work. If we did that in the NBA, then we'd get rid of half of the people of color that are really good, and we'd bring in a whole bunch of other people of a different color, maybe a bunch of Chinese, a bunch of white guys that aren't nearly as good, and we would say, okay, now we have achieved diversity. But what you're doing by doing so is you're actually being racist. When you say we want everything to be a blind audition, you're saying, I don't care about your race. We're all individuals. When you say, oh, now I want to institute you being in the orchestra based on your race, we are going backwards.
They're trying to get rid of discrimination laws so that they can discriminate.
Exactly. In California, they're trying to pass all the laws that roll back anti-discrimination laws so that then they can discriminate based on race. It's
for the sake of progressive, Brian.
It's racist. It's racism on its face being disguised and sold as anti-racism. But it's not. You can't fight racism with more racism and bigotry with more bigotry. So it goes back to, again, the individual and judging people by their the content of their character, their own skills, and the merit that they've earned within their endowment and their environment. Now, I will say this. I feel for people because the endowment that they're given with, what they're born with, isn't as good. Like, let's face it, Brent. You don't look like The Rock.
No, not even close.
Dwayne The Rock Johnson, he just was born with better endowment than you and me.
Than most people.
It's rough. And so you can't, that's just life, right? But again, the solution's still the same, even though I wasn't born with that sort of endowment. Maybe I don't want to look like The Rock. That's not the point. Pick whoever you want. Maybe you want to look like Kevin Hart. If that's your jam, you didn't get that. Okay. I'm not a short little black man. Didn't work.
Nope.
Or maybe you envy his humor, right? You didn't get that endowment. You didn't get it. You got something else. Okay. The solution is still the same. Adopt personal responsibility within my endowment, within what I have been given, what I have available to me. It doesn't seem fair, right? And you got to get over that because life isn't fair. And then it's like, well, environment to me is also a raw deal because if you're born in an inner city neighborhood with a single mother with 7 kids in a gangster kind of place without good schools and so on, you're probably going to you're going to perpetuate a sad life, maybe die young. Maybe there'll be some black on black crime where you get shot by another gang member. I'm not saying that those aren't really big issues that as a society we shouldn't be striving to overcome. But at the end of the day, the solution is still the same. At some point, the individual has to accept that responsibility to rise above it or to get out of it. And the more we teach people, oh, you're a victim and you can't, the more we will never progress. When you tell people, I know it's harsh. We had a harsh mother. When you tell people, it's all on you. No one's going to save you. No one's going to, and you can't blame your environment. You can't blame anything else. Because as much as I don't look like The Rock, I'm also not crippled and born half impaired.
You get all 10 fingers and toes.
Yeah. I'm actually pretty happy with the package I got. Could have been worse.
Could have been a lot worse.
And so everything is going to be out of balance in that regard. But the solution is still the same. It's accepting personal responsibility. And so back to Viktor Frankl, he says, since Auschwitz, we know what man is capable of. And since Hiroshima, we know what is at stake.
Yeesh.
Pretty heavy. I've been to Peace Park in Hiroshima.
What's Peace Park?
In Japan.
Is that a park they made where Ground Zero is, or
yes.
What?
Yeah, where the atomic bomb dropped. I've been through Peace Park, the Memorial Museum, and through Peace Park probably, I don't know, I lived there almost a year, and I went through Peace Park we went through the park a lot, but I went through the Memorial Museum probably 15 times. Wow. They have different exhibits that come and go as artists contribute to it. It's heavy when you look at the destruction that happened. There's photographs, there's video, there's film, there's artifacts, radioactive things, in the museum there. It's harrowing. And it's true. We know what man is capable of from Auschwitz. Some heinous, some dark evil, institutionalized evil, part of the government, systematic murdering of a group of people based on their creed and nothing else. And I think that Hiroshima definitely shows us what's at stake, because we as human beings have the capacity now with technology to destroy the world. Like I said, the whole point of today's podcast was really to hammer home the idea that we're individuals, and that's what life is about. If you like what we're doing, let us know. Leave us a comment. Use the codes on our site. Go to briancall.com. Get a t-shirt, hat. We appreciate that. All right, folks. Thanks for tuning in. Stay gritty.